Okay, and I'm back, and no echo. And sorry about that. That was super weird, and I don't know what I did wrong or if I did anything wrong, but regardless, I was hearing myself twice, and there was no way I could have done that for an hour. Sorry about that. Very strange there. Maybe there's some forces that don't want me to do the show I'm doing today. I don't know, but that was really odd. So thanks for bearing with me. I'm sorry about the false start there, but I was hearing everything I said twice, and so if you're there now, if you can do me a favor and put a message in, type that you can actually hear me, because I'm not sure that you could, and hopefully the thing is back up and you can hear me just fine. I was hearing everything I said at like a 15-second delay, and it was just, if you ever had that like on a cell phone call. Anyway, welcome to the Footlight broadcast. For those of you who don't know what just happened, I was trying to get started, and thanks, Frank. And it was really odd. And this is the Footlight broadcast. My name is Brian O'Kelly. We do broadcast from Cottage Lake, Washington. And just a couple housekeeping things. Just want to let you know, the show is a live show. I don't have an engineer here. It's just a solo guy, and doing my best. Love it if you share the show, especially today with your unbelieving friends. Anybody you know who's not sure about this Jesus thing, not really sure if this resurrection thing happened. I do think that this show will be a difference maker, and so I'm going to get right into why I'm doing this show and why I'm a Christian at all in a little bit. And some of you know, once upon a time I was an atheist. I tried really hard to be an atheist, and I just didn't have enough faith to believe that everything was random. So when I began investigating religious viewpoints, I first decided there was a God, and then I started looking at other religions because I had left Christianity over some misunderstandings that I had, especially with the church I grew up with. And so when I started investigating religions, what I found is that the only religion that would stand the scrutiny, the only faith that would stand the scrutiny, was Christianity. And one of the main reasons was that I couldn't find an effective way to argue with the fact of the resurrection. I couldn't find a way to say that the resurrection just wasn't true. And everything I looked at pointed to the idea that the resurrection was true. And so what I'm going to share with you today is the reasons why I believe that you can put your faith in the resurrection as a real event. So happy Easter, and the old saying is, he is risen indeed, just as he said he would. So why would this matter? Why is it important to believe that the resurrection is true? And here's a couple reasons why. Number one, all of Christianity, the entire faith, rests on the historical event of the resurrection. If the resurrection never happened, then Christianity is false. End of story. Christianity is just a big, mess of myths and half-truths and lies if the resurrection isn't true. And the Apostle Paul summed it up pretty nicely in 1 Corinthians 15. He said, "For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be more pitied than all men," or pitied more than all men. So Paul even says, hey, if this resurrection thing isn't true, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, this whole thing is just a big waste of time. And I agree with that. Now, another reason that this matters is because the very character of Jesus is on trial here, if that's true. We'd have to really wonder, who is this Jesus guy? Mark 8:31, it says, "He began then to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And then he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again." So if Jesus didn't rise again, then he was just full of it, right? I don't know how else to say that. And then John 2:18-20 says, "Then the Jews demanded of him, 'What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?' And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. So if the resurrection isn't true, then Jesus was just a flat liar. I mean, he's got bad character, right? And who wants to follow a guy who's got bad character? I mean, if he didn't rise from the dead, then Jesus is a false prophet, right? And nobody should follow a false prophet. I mean, in fact, Scripture, if we're going to believe the Bible at any level, the Old Testament commands us not to follow false prophets. Deuteronomy 18, Jeremiah 23. But on the other side, if Jesus really did rise from the dead, if he really did what he said, then we've got a whole different ballgame. Okay, that's a really strong confirmation that he is who he says he was. And, we have to believe the idea that God wouldn't resurrect a false prophet and confirm his message. There's no other way somebody could be resurrected except by supernatural power. And so if God did that, if a man was resurrected, God did it. And we can't imagine that God would do it only for purposes of deceiving all of mankind. So, this really comes down to a question of history. Josh McDowell, who you may know that Josh McDowell has written a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and a lot of what I'm going to share today is from Josh McDowell's stuff, along with a lot of others, but Josh McDowell is really influential on me. And here's what Josh McDowell said. He said, "After more than 700 hours of studying the subject, I've come to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is either one of the most wicked, vicious, heartless hoaxes ever foisted on the minds of human beings, or it's the most remarkable fact of history. Here are some facts relevant to the resurrection. Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish prophet who claimed to be the Christ, prophesied in the Jewish scriptures. The Christ that was prophesied in the Jewish scriptures was arrested. He was judged a political criminal. He was crucified. 3 days after his death and burial, some women who went to his tomb found the body gone. In the weeks after that, his disciples claimed that God had raised him from the dead and that he appeared to them various times before ascending into heaven. And from that foundation, Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and has continued to exert great influence down through the centuries." That's Josh McDowell, and he's right. This is exactly what we know to have happened. And that doesn't make any claims about his divinity. We just know that he was a Jewish prophet. He did claim to be the Messiah. He was killed as a political criminal. We know that after he was buried, some women claimed he was gone, and that the gospel spread like wildfire. That's what we know from history. Whether you believe Jesus was a divine figure or not doesn't have anything to do with whether those facts are true. And so in establishing the historicity of the resurrection, what we need to assume, we don't need to even assume that the New Testament is inspired. We don't even have to believe that it's trustworthy. Now, I do believe those things, but what we're going to focus on is 3 truths that are so strong that they're accepted by serious historians from every background. Okay, so any theory against the resurrection has to be able to account for these 3 points. And the 3 points are: number 1, the tomb in which Jesus was buried was discovered empty by a group of women on Sunday following the crucifixion. That we know to be true. Jesus' disciples had real experiences with one that they at least believed to be Jesus. Now, they may have been faked out. We'll talk about that in a minute, but they at least believed it. And as a result of the preaching of these guys, with the resurrection as the central point, the Christian church was established and grew like crazy. So those are 3 facts of history that everyone agrees on. And so what are some of the historical things that we can look at that causes wide agreement on that? And these are non-biblical sources, which matters. There was a Jewish historian that some of you may have heard of named Josephus. And Josephus was a Roman historian. He was hired by the Romans, if you will, and he was their employee, for lack of a better way to say it. And Josephus was on the scene, right after, and he was, he was Jewish, but he wasn't a believer in Jesus, and he was chronicling the events of the time and the place and the area. And so here's what Josephus has to say about this. He said, when Pilate, quote, when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified. So Josephus, verifies as a historian for the Romans that Jesus was crucified. Another Roman historian, Cornelius Tacitus, Tacitus is what most people call him. He also reported the crucifixion of Jesus as a historical event. Here's what he says. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So Cornelius is saying, look, Nero burned Christians. He lit them on fire, covered in oil, to light his gardens. Nero was so evil, and he hated the Christians. And Tacitus says that Christianity was started by this guy who Pontius Pilate crucified, gave the extreme penalty, which that was the most extreme penalty that the Romans had to offer, was death by crucifixion on a cross. It was reserved for criminals that they wanted to make a public spectacle of. Now, another historian of the time, or contemporary of the time, Mara Bar Seppian, from AD 73, Bar Seppian wrote a letter to his son from prison. And in the letter he wrote, "What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king, seeing that from that very time their kingdom was taken from them?" So this was written 3 years after the end of, thanks, Daryl, for being back. And this was written 3 years after AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. And this Marabar Seppian says to his son, hey, what good was it for the Jews to have worshiped this guy? Following this guy is what ended up with the Romans crushing Judaism and destroying the temple. It was this Jesus guy's fault. So, and his question is, what advantage did they gain from executing him? Kind of confirming that he was executed by Pilate and the Romans, but because of the influence of Caiaphas and the high priest and the Sanhedrin, right? Now, the Jewish Talmud, you wouldn't think that you would look in the Talmud, in the teachings of Talmudic Judaism, for proof of Jesus' crucifixion, but it is right there in the Talmud. Here's what it says in the Talmud, which was probably written during the late 2nd century. And this is a hostile source, right? This is not a pro-Christian source. And here's what the Talmud says. On the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. So it's interesting that even in the Jewish Talmud, they make the claim that Jesus was practicing sorcery. So they actually talk about the fact that he did supernatural things. So even those who say, well, Jesus didn't do anything supernatural, well, the Talmud kind of says so. So from these sources, none of this is in the Bible. From these sources, we can establish one thing for sure, that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius on the eve of the Passover. This corresponds exactly with the gospel accounts, but if we didn't have the gospel accounts, we have it from contemporaries, okay? Now, one of the ways that people that historians determine if something is true is an inference from what they call inference to the best explanation. William Lane Craig, who I mentioned in last week's broadcast, describes this as an approach where we, quote, begin with the evidence available to us and then infer what would, if true, provide the best explanation for that evidence. In other words, we ought to accept an event as historical if it gives us the best explanation for the things that we do know for sure that surround it. And so when we look at the evidence, the truth of the resurrection emerges pretty clearly as the best explanation for the things that we know. And there's not even another theory that can come close to accounting for the evidence. And we're going to look at the facts for the resurrection, and then we're going to look at the theories that are alternate to it. So one of the questions that is important, of course, is the New Testament reliable? And for those of you who want to go back, I think it was the second episode that I did, which was about the history of the scriptures and how we got them. And I did 2 more episodes on proofs for the Bible. But I'll just briefly summarize here. The New Testament is the primary source for information on the resurrection. And a lot of critics during the 19th century, during the 1800s, attacked the reliability of the biblical documents. But by the end of the 19th century, by the turn of the 20th century, archaeological discoveries had confirmed the accuracy of the New Testament manuscripts. There are now 14,000 copies, or 24,000 copies, I guess, of early New Testament fragments and pieces, and really there's no real question about it. William F. Albright, who was the world's foremost biblical archaeologist when he was alive, said, "We can already say emphatically that there's no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. 2 full generations before the date between 130 and 150 given by the more new radical New Testament critics of today." Sir William Ramsay was a historian. He spent 15 years of his life trying to undermine Luke's credentials. He wanted to prove that Luke was not a good historian. Here's what William Ramsay said after 15 years of trying to prove Luke to be no good. Here's what he said, quote, "Luke is a historian of the first rank. The author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians." And that's not because William Ramsay wanted to believe the Bible. It's because as he looked at Luke's history and compared it to everything else available, he found Luke's history to be fitting to the facts. Now, here's some background on this, and this is important. The New Testament is reliable, right? But the backdrop of the resurrection matters. We're going to talk about that and living witnesses to it. So the New Testament witnesses were fully aware of the scenario where this took place, right? So let me give you some background here. The body of Jesus, according to Jewish burial custom, was wrapped in a linen cloth. There's about 100 pounds of aromatic spices mixed together, and they made this like gummy paste out of it that they embalmed bodies with, and they applied it to the wrappings of the cloth around the body. So first they'd wrap the body up, and then they'd put all of this gummy stuff all over the outside of it. And the gummy stuff was, for lack of a better way to whatever to call it, was to keep insects. I hate to say it this way, but they did it for every body, right? It was to keep insects from eating the body, if you will, and from having disease and pestilence come out of every tomb. And so they would wrap this stuff around the body, and it wasn't so much to preserve the body as much as it was to keep disease from spreading from where every grave and every tomb were. And so then they put Jesus's body in a solid rock tomb, and this was customary, right? If you were rich, you had a tomb, and Joseph of Arimathea that donated his tomb was a rich guy. So they put him in a rock tomb, and then a big stone was rolled against the entrance of the tomb. And these stones were so large, and the reason they were large is they were intended not to be easy to move by people who might be grave robbers, because often people were buried with things that were of value to them, right? And so these stones were normally like 2 tons, like 4,000 pounds, or I don't know what that is, 2,500 kilos or something like that. Maybe it's 1,500 kilos, but 4,000 pounds. And they were typically moved by means of big levers. And it took a bunch of people to do it. And they were rolled in front of a tomb entrance. Now, those are facts. A Roman guard of strictly disciplined fighting men was stationed to guard the tomb. And the guard affixed on the tomb the Roman seal, which was meant to prevent any attempt at vandalizing the tomb. It was to indicate if it had been opened, right? So anyone trying to move the stone would have broken the seal and been in real trouble with the Romans. Now, Matthew's gospel tells us why that was done. Chapter 27, verse 62. Let me read it here. It says, "The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate. 'Sir,' they said, We remember that while he was alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell people that he's been raised from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. So these people knew that Jesus had predicted his own resurrection. And so Pilate wanted to make sure that he had stamped out this Christianity thing, this Jesus worship, this Jesus followers. He wanted to stamp it out for good. He had executed him, and he wanted to make sure, using the force of the Roman soldiers, that Jesus stayed in the tomb, that this guy wasn't getting out of there, and they weren't going to perpetuate this hoax. And so 3 days later, though, the tomb was empty. The followers of Jesus said he'd risen from the dead. They reported that he appeared to them during a period of 40 days, showing himself to them by many infallible proofs, as it's said. And Paul the Apostle recounted that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people, the majority of whom were still alive and who could confirm what Paul wrote. So Paul wrote this down. He says, hey, look, this guy is out there. He's appeared to 500 people. You can go ask him. Paul is appealing to people to go check it out. Okay, not the kind of thing you do when you're trying to perpetrate a lie and a hoax. So there were so many security precautions taken between the trial, the crucifixion, the burial, the entombment, the sealing, the guarding of Jesus' tomb, that it becomes very difficult for critics to defend their position that he didn't rise from the dead. But let's talk about how they do it a little bit. And so we have these living witnesses, right? The New Testament accounts of the resurrection were being circulated within the lifetimes of men and women who were alive at the time of the resurrection. And these people certainly could have confirmed or denied that these accounts were accurate. The writers of the four Gospels had themselves been witnesses, or else were relating accounts of eyewitnesses, like in the case of Luke, of the actual events. Mark, we know, Mark was the scribe of Peter. And so Mark was writing down Peter's account. We could, in some ways, call the Gospel of Mark the Gospel of Peter, because it was really Peter's story as written by Mark. And so in advocating their case for the gospel, the apostles appealed to common knowledge concerning the facts of the resurrection. They said, look, ask anybody. This guy's been up and around and walking. Lots of people have seen him. And there's a lot of people who are saying they're eyewitnesses, right? And so F.F. Bruce, he was the Rylands Professor of Biblical Criticism and Exegesis at the University of Manchester. Here's what he says concerning the value of the New Testament records as primary sources. He says, had there been any tendency to depart from the facts in any material respect, the possible presence of hostile witnesses in the audience would have served as a further corrective. Next, there's evidence that Jesus' disciples had real experiences with one whom they believed was the risen Christ. This isn't even disputed today, guys. The question of whether or not the disciples believed it isn't disputed. They did believe it, and no one argues with whether they believed it. Now, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 15 through verses 3 through 8 here, here's what Paul says. He records this ancient creed concerning Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And here's what he says. And again, it's 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 8. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's to Peter, right? And then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. And it's pretty widely agreed that Paul received this creed from Peter and James somewhere between 3 and 5 years after the crucifixion. Now, Peter and James are listed in the creed as having seen the risen Jesus, and since they're the ones who gave the creed to Paul, this really becomes a statement of their own testimony. And as the Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapide has said, or Pincus, I think, Lapide has said, this creed may be considered the statement of eyewitnesses. Now, I recognize that just because the disciples thought they saw Jesus doesn't mean that they really did, right? They believed it, or at least they put on the pretty good show if they didn't believe it. But here are some possibilities to explain the living witnesses. Number one, they were just lying. They could have been just lying. The disciples could be just lying. Let's just get that out there on the table, and we'll talk about it here in a second. Number two, they were hallucinating. Maybe these guys were on some magic mushrooms or something. Who knows? But maybe they were hallucinating. And of course, the third explanation is that for them believing it is that they really did see the risen Jesus. So what we're going to try and explore here is what was the most likely. And so let's talk about whether they were lying or not. For them to be lying, we have to believe that the disciples knew that Jesus hadn't really risen, but they made it up. And so here's a question we'd have to ask. I know that sometimes people will go to the mat for a lie and they'll try and perpetuate it, as long as they can and tell the great story and all that. But the idea that 10 of his disciples would die as martyrs, that they would go all the way to being killed by the authorities for their lie is pretty unlikely. Okay. And the other two didn't die. They never recanted their testimony. They didn't die as martyrs, but they died natural deaths. And so the idea that 10 of the disciples would willingly say, yeah, I'd rather die than give up my lie. If it was a lie, I got to think that at least one of them would have said, no, made it all up. Please don't kill me. It's all fabrication, and we just wanted to get this thing going because we wanted to be famous. But please don't kill me. But no, 10 of them went to their death, and often people will die for a lie that they believe is the truth, but they won't die for a lie that they know is false. So, for example, we have people today who are commit suicide bombers, right? The suicide bombers and people who have, like the David Koresh, the Branch Davidians. People die for a lie when they believe it to be true. People don't die for a lie when they know that it's false. They just don't. And so the disciples for sure believed that this was true. We can't reasonably believe, at least I don't think any reasonable person would believe, that 10 people would give their lives for something they knew to be a falsehood. Not all of them. It's just hard to fathom, right? And so we've seen, like in modern prosecutions, one of the things prosecutors use is they try and get a whole bunch of people who are involved in a conspiracy together, and they're looking for one who wants to save his skin. And they usually find one that wants to save his skin and turn as what they call state's evidence. The idea that none of the disciples would turn state's evidence against the other ones and say, yeah, we made it all up, is pretty hard to believe. Now let's talk about hallucination. They could have all hallucinated, right? This is another way that we could explain the resurrection. I don't think it's true, and I'll tell you why here. But another attempted explanation claims that the appearances of Jesus after the resurrection were illusions or hallucinations. So there's some psychological principles that govern the appearance of hallucinations. And these hallucinations don't coincide with the historical situation. So again, where was the actual body? Why wasn't it produced? The hallucination theory becomes untenable because it can't explain the physical nature of the appearances. The disciples recorded eating and drinking with Jesus, as well as touching him. You can't do that with a hallucination. Second, it's pretty unlikely that they would have all had the same hallucination, that 500 people and the disciples would have all had the same hallucinations. Pretty unlikely, because hallucinations are pretty individual occurrences, right? And they're not group projections. Imagine if I said to you, hey, wasn't that a great dream I had last night? Hallucinations, like dreams, don't transfer. Further, the hallucination theory doesn't explain the conversion of Paul 3 years later. Paul was a persecutor of Christians. There was no reason for Paul to change his mind. There was no advantage in it for him. In fact, there was nothing but trouble for him that came from it. And so this is a crazy idea that Paul would have had the same hallucination 3 years later as the rest of the the disciples had 3 years earlier. And most significantly, the hallucination theory can't deal at all with the evidence for the empty tomb, which we're going to get into the evidence for the empty tomb here in a minute. So since the disciples couldn't have been lying, couldn't have been hallucinating, at least not reasonably, we can't believe that, we only have one more reasonable explanation left, and that's that the disciples believed they had seen the risen Jesus because they really had seen the risen Jesus. I mean, that's the best explanation available, is that that's why they believed it. So the resurrection appearances alone demonstrate the resurrection pretty strongly. But let's just say that we don't accept that you're a person who doesn't accept that the testimony of the disciples, the fact that they went to be martyred, the fact that hallucination doesn't hold up, that's not sufficient to give you any belief. Well, another thing we can appeal to then is the real proof of the disciples' lives. And, one of the things we have to look at is, were there any benefits? If they were lying and made it up, were there any benefits to them for doing it? Because people will lie for their own advantage, right? People lie to gain something all the time. We know that. So what was the advantage to the disciples of this lie? Well, do you know of any visible benefits to them? Did they get prestige? Did they get wealth? Did they get social status? Did they get money? I mean, if those things happened, we might logically account for the idea that they had this allegiance to this story they made up. What we still can't account for is that if all that were taken away and they were threatened with death by the Romans, that they would have maintained their lie. The reward for their efforts for these Christians was that they were beaten, and they kept telling the story. They were stoned to death, not all together. They saw one stone, another stone. They were thrown to the lions. They were tortured and crucified, and yet all of them persisted in their story. Why would you do that if you know you made it up? So there was every conceivable method and pressure that the Jewish authorities and the Roman government had to try and get somebody to shut up, and yet they persisted in their story. They laid down their lives as the ultimate proof of their complete confidence in the truth of their message. Now, we do have some evidences of that from the way people wrote about them. Clement of Rome was an apostolic father, and what that means is he was a contemporary of the apostles themselves, who alive at the same time, and as such, here are his teachings that can be traced back to the apostles themselves. Clement records the martyrdom of both Peter and Paul. Here's what Clement says: "Through envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church have been persecuted and put to death. Let us set before our eyes the illustrious apostles. Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors, and when he had at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due him. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance. After being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee and stoned, after preaching both in the East and the West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and come to the extreme limit of the West, and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Thus he was removed from the world and went to the holy place, having proved himself a striking example of patience." So Clement is saying, look, these guys got the crap beat out of them. They got the snot beat out of them. They were thrown into the gulag. Paul 7 times was thrown into the gulag. These guys were beaten and harassed by the government, and yet they just kept on saying what they knew to be true. You can do what you want to me. Jesus is the risen King. Josephus, we talked about earlier, about his testimony of the crucifixion. Josephus talks about the martyrdom of James. Here's what Josephus says: "Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against him as the breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." So the Sanhedrin brought these guys together, and they delivered them to be stoned, and yet in the process of that, they never recanted at all. And by the way, guys, if you're watching live or recorded, it'd be great if you share the show. Sharing the show is how it grows, and hopefully this is valuable enough that you think it's worth sharing. Ignatius, the bishop of the church in Antioch in Syria, he was another apostolic father, believed to have personally known the apostles in the case of Ignatius. He was martyred himself by being torn to pieces by wild animals in the amphitheater of Rome. And when the Church of Rome sought to intercede on his behalf, he wrote his now famous letter to the church forbidding any interferences in his martyrdom. So he's in prison. The church is trying to get him out of prison. And here's what he wrote when he knew he was going to be martyred. When, for instance, he came to those who were with Peter, he said to them, "Lay hold, handle me, and see that I am not an incorporeal spirit." And immediately they touched him and believed, being convinced both by his flesh and his spirit. For this cause also they despised death and were found its conquerors. So Ignatius is saying, listen, you can do what you want to me. I am not going to back off of this, because I knew guys that knew Jesus, and these guys I know to be truthful because they went to their death for it too. And I'm happy to do so also, rather than recant what I know to be true. Polycarp was a guy who's another apostolic father. He was a personal disciple of the Apostle John. And he was also martyred himself for his belief. Polycarp was a guy that they burned at the stake for refusing to renounce his faith. Around AD 110, Polycarp recounted the willingness of the apostles to die for their belief. Here's what Polycarp said before he himself was burned at the stake for his belief. Paul himself and the rest of the apostles, this is Polycarp, quote, "Paul himself and the rest of the apostles this do in the assurance that they have not run in vain, but in faith and righteousness, and that they are now in their due place in the presence of the Lord, with whom also they suffered. For they loved not this present world, but him who died for us, and for our sakes was raised again by God from the dead." So Polycarp went to his death believing this because he knew John. He had seen the apostles so firm in their faith that it didn't matter what anybody said to them. You couldn't shake these guys off of what they knew to be true, that Jesus had himself risen from the dead. Now, it should be, of interest that two of these disciples of the apostles became martyrs themselves. So not only did the apostles go to be martyred, two of their disciples here, Ignatius and Polycarp, went to be martyred also. And so they for sure believed that the apostles believed it. And if the early apostles weren't willing to die for their beliefs, they shouldn't expect more from their followers, right? So the theory that the disciples were lying is really just absurd. And almost all scholars admit today that if nothing else, that the disciples believed it, that whether that was really true or not, even the secular historians and scholars today say, well, listen, these guys for sure believed it to be true. So the idea that they're lying, it's just a non-starter, right? Now, let's consider some facts of the situation. Fact number one, the Roman seal was broken, okay? The seal that was put on the tomb, this stood for the power and authority of the Roman Empire. And the consequences of breaking the seal were pretty severe. And so, when the seal was found to be broken, basically the Roman Empire called into place their, for lack of a better saying, their FBI of the time, right? They they brought him in and said, "Hey, look, this thing's broken. You guys got to go out and find out who it is that broke this seal." So that's the first fact. And if anyone who is caught doing that would have automatically been executed by crucifixion. People were really afraid of the Romans. Jesus' disciples even displayed signs of being frightened. They hid themselves, right? And Peter, one of the disciples, went out and denied Christ. They were so afraid of the Romans, right? The empty tomb. Here's some important facts about the empty tomb. This is obvious stuff, but the empty tomb, Jesus was preached in the same city where the empty tomb was, right? If they were going to get away with a false doctrine, it would have been a lot easier out of town than it would be in the same town. They were talking about the empty tomb, and the reality is it was too notorious to be denied. Paul Altheus states the resurrection could not have been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all to be concerned. The source in Mark, which again was mostly the recount of Peter, is within 7 years. The burial story, the story of Jesus being buried, was known to be reliable. So they knew he'd been buried. They knew the tomb was empty. And then another point here is that they didn't ever make a shrine of the tomb. Okay, and this is really important because the tradition was that where the bones of a prophet were known to be, there was almost always a shrine made there. And Gamaliel, who was a member of the Jewish High Court, put forth the suggestion that the rise of the Christian movement was God's doing. Now, he couldn't have done that if he knew that the body was still in the tomb. So the empty tomb becomes pretty well established. Another couple more points is that there's no sign of legendary development. And the reason for this is because legends, number one, they take a lot of time. And this story was circulating right away. It was known right away that this tomb was empty. And you can't develop a legend in a few days. It just doesn't work that way. And then another thing that's important along these lines is that the tomb was, the report was made that it was women who announced this, right? And women were basically considered to be worthless, if you will. And that's unfortunate, but in that society, women were not considered to be the strongest witness. And so for the discovery to have been reported by women is one of the things that really backs up the idea that it's not a made-up story. Because if it was a made-up story, they would have made it up that men heroically were spoken to by Jesus. The idea that it was women who found, or who reported the empty tomb first, it's the best explanation in town is that the tomb really was empty. Fact number 3, the large stone was moved on the Sunday morning. The first thing that impressed people who approached the tomb was the unusual position of the 1 to 2 ton stone that was in front of the doorway. All the gospel writers mention it. Those who observed the stone after its resurrection describe its position as having been rolled up a slope away from not just the entrance of the tomb, but from the whole thing. And it was in such a position that it looked as if it had been picked up and carried away. Now, let's just think about this. We've got sleeping guards. Let's say the guards fell asleep, right? Which there's no way they would have. We're going to talk about that here in a second. But we're going to believe that the disciples tiptoed around these sleeping guards and moved 2 tons of stone without waking them up. It's pretty hard to believe, right? Now, what happens is after the tomb is discovered to be open, what do the Roman guards do? These guys took off. They went AWOL. And that just doesn't happen with Roman guards. The military discipline of Roman guards was so exceptional. Justin, in Digest number 49, mentions that all offenses of Roman guards required the death penalty. The fear of their superior's wrath and the possibility of death meant that they paid pretty close attention to the minute details of their job. One of the ways guards were put to death was they would strip him of his clothes and then burn him alive in a fire that was started with his garments. And if it wasn't apparent which soldier had failed in his duty, then they would draw lots to see which one in the group would be punished for the death of the unit's failure. And so the idea that all of the Roman guards that were there to guard the tomb would have fallen asleep, and that while they were asleep, the disciples would have come in and rolled the stone away to steal the body, it just doesn't make any sense. The Romans were known to have had a guy named George Curry, Dr. George Curry, a student of Roman military discipline. Here's what he wrote, that the fear of punishment, quote, produced flawless attention to duty, especially in the night watches. The Roman guards simply didn't fall asleep. Not true. Fact number 5, grave clothes tell us a tale. In a literal sense, against all statements to the contrary, the tomb wasn't totally empty. If you had stolen the body, you'd have just stolen it with the grave clothes intact, right? You would have carried it away. It would have been easier, right? So you're supposed to believe that they woke up the guards, or they toed around the guards, they rolled the stone away, and then they unwrapped Jesus from all the grave clothes and left all the grave clothes in there, right? Well, not exactly. The grave clothes were left in there, undisturbed in form and position, except for the part over the face, which was known to be folded. Fact number 6, Jesus' appearance were confirmed. He appeared alive on several occasions after Easter. When we establish a fact of history, one of the things we look at is were there eyewitnesses? And we talked already about this, but there were a lot of eyewitnesses to not only Jesus on that same day, but on the days subsequent. So Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, who's an associate professor of history at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, here's what he says. What gives a special authority to the list of witnesses as historical evidence is a reference to most of the 500 brethren being still alive. St. Paul says, in effect, if you don't believe me, you can ask them. Such a statement in what we know to be a genuine letter written within 30 years of the event is almost as strong a evidence as one could hope to get for something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. So imagine if you had 500 people and you were bringing them to a courtroom and saying, hey, did you see this? Hey, did you see this? Hey, did you see this? And I only did it 3 times there and I'm already bored. 500 people on the stand over and over and over again. If they each testified for just about 6 minutes, you'd have 50 hours of testimony. And so, I mean, this is just hard to refute, especially when Paul is saying, if you don't believe my letter, go ahead and check it out. Now, another crucial factor in this is hostile witnesses. There were people who were just flat hostile to the idea of the resurrection, who did, say that he appeared, or that they heard people talk about it. So, and one of which, not the least of which, is Saul of Tarsus, right? No one would have guessed that Saul of Tarsus would become a follower of Jesus. This guy was a persecutor of Jesus. And so the argument that Jesus only appeared to followers is an argument from silence. And arguments from silence, of course, can be dangerous. It's also possible that everybody Jesus appeared to became a follower. Not that they already were, but they became a follower. And no one acquainted with the facts can really say that Jesus appeared to just an insignificant few. Christians believe that Jesus was bodily resurrected in time and space by the supernatural power of God, and the difficulties of believing this are great because it is a miracle, but this is the nature of miracles. The nature of miracles is simply that they are suspensions of the natural order, and in this case, the resurrection of a human being is the suspension of a natural order, but we have so many witnesses and evidences that it's hard to walk away from. Now, a couple other theories that have been proposed. It was the wrong tomb, that the women just went to the wrong tomb. And so that would be simple, because as soon as they went and said to the disciples, hey, listen, the tomb is empty, Jesus isn't in there, well, for sure the disciples would have gone to the right tomb. The idea that they didn't know where it was, and that they would have been faked, they would have gone to the right tomb. And when the story began to circulate, what would have happened is the Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities would have said, no, you guys got it all wrong. This is his tomb over here. See the guards? See the seal on it? That would have happened. So the idea that it was the wrong tomb, that story just doesn't work. Now, people have postulated the idea that Jesus didn't really die, that he just swooned, that he just, passed out. And he wasn't really dead. He fainted from exhaustion and loss of blood. Everybody thought he was dead, and then later he got up. Okay, well, let's just say that that's true. Just for the sake of discussion, we have to believe a few things then. We have to believe, number one, that the Romans and the Jewish authorities, that these guys couldn't identify a dead body from a living one. We have to believe that the people who wrapped the grave clothes around him and put the embalming stuff on him, the gummy paste on him that the grave clothes were covered with, that they didn't notice him breathing. We have to believe that. Then we have to believe that this half-dead guy who was so weak that he passed out from loss of blood, that after he was wrapped up by people who couldn't identify a dead body and didn't notice him breathing, that he then moved the 2-ton stone out of the way. This just really doesn't make any sense, the idea that Jesus swooned. How about the body being stolen? We talked a little bit about this. The disciples were in a state of initial depression and fear. And the idea that the disciples, who were not warriors, these guys weren't trained, with a sword. The idea that these guys would have come and attempted to steal the body, expecting that there were Roman soldiers there who we have no reason to believe would have fallen asleep, that more likely than not, they would have expected the detachment of soldiers to be able to defeat them. The idea that these guys came there with the idea of stealing the body, when the guard was put there for purposes of making sure that didn't happen, is pretty difficult to believe. And, the theory that there's a theory that Jewish or Roman authorities moved his body to keep it secure. And so if that was the case, then when the disciples were out talking about Jesus resurrecting, they would have said, well, wait a minute, we got his body right over here. We knew you guys were going to try this, so we actually put him in a different place than you thought he was, and here's the body. But that didn't happen. And so they never did issue a rebuttal. And so the conclusion of all of this, in my view, is that he is risen indeed. Professor Thomas Arnold, 14 years a headmaster of rugby, author of the famous History of Rome, and appointed the chair of modern history at Oxford. He was pretty well acquainted with the value of evidence in determining historical facts. Here's what he said. I've been used for many years to study the histories of other times and to examine and weigh the evidence of those who've written about them, and I know of no one fact in the history of mankind which is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer than the great sign which God has given us, that Christ died and rose again from the dead. Brooke Foss Westcott, an English scholar, said, taking all the evidence together, it's not too much to say that there's no historic incident better or more variously supported than the resurrection of Christ. Nothing but the antecedent assumption that it must be false could have suggested the idea of deficiency in the proof of it. So with that, I will close the program, and thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm sorry about the rough start there. Hopefully you found this valuable, and hopefully it builds your faith and gives you some assurance that you can, in fact, believe in the resurrection. You can believe in the living Jesus, that he does love you, does care for you, that he did die for your sins on a cross, and that he does, in fact, live and want to know you and want you to know him. So I hope you found value in what I had to share today, and that's the show for today. Please do share the broadcast. That is how it grows, and share it on all the social media you have, whichever channels those are. Share a link with anybody you think might be skeptical. Let people know that Jesus is the real deal, that you can put your faith and trust in him for today, for tomorrow, and for eternity. Thanks again. My name is Brian O'Kelly. This has been the Footlight Broadcast for Easter Sunday. He is risen. He is risen indeed. God bless you all.